Here I've collected all of our information from the previous videos. I've also collected the sign chart that we drew in our last video. Using that sign chart and all the information that we have on the left, we will now sketch a graph of our rational function. We'll begin by drawing the asymptotes. We can think of the asymptotes as barriers. The vertical asymptote at x equals 4 will be a vertical barrier, and the horizontal asymptote will be a horizontal barrier. Let's mark down x equals 4 and then draw a vertical line there. So underneath my 4 on the number line above, I will draw that dotted line to symbolize that asymptote. And then for the horizontal asymptote at y equals 2, I will draw a horizontal line to show the other asymptote. Now I will place my intercepts on that graph. I know my x-intercept is -5, 0, and we'll mark that with a closed circle about where that -5 is on my number line. I will also mark my y-intercept at 0, -5/2, and that will be somewhere below the axis. We'll put that about here. I know that my line must pass through those two closed dots. I'm also going to place my hole as well. My hole will be at -1, -8/5. So my hole is here at -1. I'll go down on the graph and I'll approximate the -8/5 as a little more than -1.5. I know that should be somewhere between my two closed dots. As long as I get my x at -1 on the x-coordinate, that'll give me a pretty reasonable estimate. Now that I've placed my hole and my two intercepts and my asymptotes, let's check the sign chart. In region A, which I'm labeling on the graph now, I need to make sure that I start out by being positive, but I have to make sure I'm negative after I cross through that closed dot. This means that I have to make sure that I don't draw above the horizontal asymptote. If I began drawing above the horizontal asymptote, I would have to cross through the horizontal asymptote in order to get to that dot. That's not going to be allowed, and we need to make sure we don't do that. Therefore, I'm not going to draw above the asymptote. I'm going to start by drawing below the asymptote. I'm going to make sure that crosses through the closed dot and the hole and the y-intercept, and we're going to continue on to the right, but I am not allowed to cross through the vertical asymptote, and I need to make sure that I go off toward -infinity. This is because I know that this line doesn't go positive until after the asymptote. I must make sure my line stays negative between -5 and +4 on the number line. Therefore, when I reach this asymptote, I have no choice but to go more negative because my sign chart says that I must be negative until I reach that asymptote. However, on the other side of that asymptote, I know that I must turn positive for region D. Therefore, in region D, I have to make sure my line is above the horizontal asymptote to make sure that I don't end up in the negative zone on this coordinate axis. So we'll draw an up arrow here at the top, and I'm going to make sure my line runs along the horizontal and vertical asymptotes. I'm coming in from +infinity, running along the asymptote, and then making a curve, and then switching over to the horizontal asymptote and running off toward the right, all the way toward infinity. So not only have we obeyed the asymptotes and the intercepts, but we're also in line with the sign chart. I was positive in region A, I switched to negative for region B, I went through the hole, which took me into region C, but I have to make sure I remain negative, so I can't go back up and I can't cross that horizontal asymptote at y equals 2. Therefore, I will continue onward toward the vertical asymptote and go down toward -infinity. But since region D must be positive, I have to come in from +infinity. And again, I'm not allowed to cross the asymptote, so I just run along them. And so this is the information that we have to gather in order to draw a graph, and this is how we arrange the information we gathered to make that graph. Note that this graph isn't perfect. For one thing, my line shouldn't squiggle quite so much, and it should run a little bit closer to the asymptotes. That's because this graph isn't perfectly to scale. If the graphs you draw are not perfectly to scale, that's probably fine. Just make sure you run along the asymptotes as you come in from infinity, and make sure you pass through all the points that you've marked in the information on the left side of this slide.